everybody. Welcome to the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. Thanks for joining me for this episode. What's going on? What's happening? I hope you're okay. I hope you don't have Ebola yet. Apparently, we're all going to get it, at least if you listen to the mainstream, quote-unquote, media. I have very little to say about Ebola beyond the idea that, Americans love to panic and love to panic about the things that don't matter. And Ebola seems to be something that is a very, very distant threat to the American way of life, and yet blown out of proportion by people who are, hysterical, misguided, and have veins coursing with ideology that they're not aware is there, I think, or they're not sure where it comes from. Or have any coherent idea of who they are, etc. When I think about the Ebola thing, I've been writing a little bit about colonialism recently, or doing a little research about colonialism. Don't ask why, but I've been, looking into, the roots of particularly, European colonialism that started around the 15th century with our dear friend Columbus. It was Columbus Day yesterday, and it was kind of, I didn't plan it this way, but I ended up doing a lot of research about that stuff, or that kind of stuff, yesterday. And, for me, what was striking about it was not so much how awful the whole process was, in terms of, exploitation and domination of other people by these elites. Does it sound familiar to you? But what struck me about it most was the language. And this is some like Edward Said shit here, but like the language used to describe people from Africa, people from Asia, people from the Middle East, people from India, people that are like brown, people from the quote unquote East, the people that have been, placed and depicted in the imagination of the West as inferior in a million different ways, whether it be biological, evolutionary, etc. But what was most striking about it is how much the language of virus, the language of contagion, the language of disease and sickness permeates imperial language. And how the language around Ebola right now, and the fear around that some dirty African is going to get on a plane and bring something biological that destroys the entire country, is so deeply rooted in the same ideological structures that produce imperialism that it's scary to think that we're living in the same 600-year process of the West imagining the East in this terribly destructive way. And I hope that makes sense to you. But that, when I see all this Ebola coverage and I see the hysteria and I hear people asking about it on the street and my students asking about it, do you think someone will bring it over? Do you think the disease from Africa will come here? The language of it, the attitude behind it, and what it reveals is incredibly disturbing about American culture and about the West, and the way we still are stuck in this kind of paranoid structure of fear. So I hope that makes sense to you, and I hope that you're not buying the Ebola stuff, and that we continue focusing on the things, the structures that actually do matter and actually do impact American lives. Today I talked to someone who has worked a lot in labor, in the academy, and in real life too. I guess separating those two things. But Steve Brier, Professor Steve Brier, is at the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. He's someone who I know through his work at the American Social History Project. They are responsible for a book called "Who Built America," which is a fantastic work of labor and social history, and should be read by everybody to understand literally who built America. But Steve Brier told me, I finally got to sit down with him, and he was an advisor on my dissertation. He knows a lot about the 60s social and political explosion on college campuses. He was present during the opening shots of the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964. He has had such a rich experience in his life of the past 40 or 50 years of American political history, and he told me a lot about his upbringing, some crazy stories about his father's time in London fighting Nazis basically on the streets, Really, really interesting, amazing stuff that I did not know about him. So I was really, really happy to be able to find some time during a busy semester to sit down and hear some stories from Steve Brier. I hope you enjoy them. You can find more podcast conversations like this at nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com. You can go to iTunes and search Nostalgia Trap. You can like Nostalgia Trap Facebook page and get updates on new stuff. And of course, all of the episodes are available on Stitcher.com as well. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. This is me and Professor Steve Brier. Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask you. Is do you think of yourself as part of that baby boom generation? Is that like an identity?
I'm literally. I'd like to tell the story. I'm the first baby boom
baby.
Baby.
Yeah.
Well,
you're born on like VJ Day.
I was born. No, I was born 9 months after VE Day.
Okay.
I'm born in England.
Okay.
My dad was in the British Army.
Oh wow.
The war ended, let us say effectively in June.
Right.
Count 9 months. I'm born in March of 1946.
Wow, that's something.
My sister was born in 38. I was born in March of 46. I was the welcome home baby.
Wow. And were you raised in England?
No, just for the first 3 years. We moved to the United States when I was not quite 3 years old.
And where did your family move?
We moved to Los Angeles. My mother had an older brother who lived out there, and she'd visited L.A. as a single woman in the 1930s, which was a very unusual trip for a working-class Jewish girl from the East End of London to take.
I would think so.
And she never forgot the palm trees and the weather. And during the war, for 5.5 years when my dad was in the service, she was alone in an East London apartment, and as you know, East London was heavily bombed by the Germans. She spent much of World War II under the dining room table waiting for the roof to literally fall in, which it didn't, thank God. And thinking that the way she was going to survive this, she kept remembering Southern California. So Southern California was like her vision. When my dad came out of the service in 46, late 46, I was already born. London was still there was rationing in London all the way into 1950, so there was no food. East End was completely destroyed where we lived and where my father had worked, and my mother just sort of made up her mind. She said to my dad, "We got to leave. We got to migrate to the States. We'll build a life for our kids there." And so we moved to the United States. And we came over on the Queen Mary.
The Queen Mary that's still like in Long Beach right now?
Yeah, well now it's docked.
But
we came over on that boat in the winter of 1948.
Wow.
And we landed in New York in December or January of 49. I was 2 3/4. I wasn't even 3 yet.
Yeah, so these are not memories of yours, but
well, their memories are implanted, by the family stories, and we took trains across. They couldn't afford. No one flew in 1949. Certainly not poor working class, people. So we took the train across, and we ended up in Southern California. And we struggled. My dad couldn't get work for a long time. We were living with my uncle.
What was your dad doing?
My dad was a fur worker. That was his skill in England, but the difference was in the United States. He was what's called a nailer. The nailer is the worker who stretches the skins to the pattern and literally nails it to a board, that gives the coat or the stole or the whatever it is, the cape, its shape and fullness. Very skilled, highly
skilled. He's like a skilled garment worker.
He's like a skilled garment worker, but above that. And so, but they did it differently in England than they did in the United States. In England, they use pins and a hammer. And in the United States, they use staples.
It seems to be a common story with immigration, and it's interesting to hear it from your father coming from England, even England to the United States. There's kind of a difference of you have a certain profession in your home country, you come to the United States, and it doesn't work that way here, and you're out of a job.
That's right. So he was unemployed for a long time. He pumped gas for $1 an hour.
Wow.
You know, we lived in the Crenshaw district, now what would be called Watts. You know, that part of that
was
part
it a black area then?
No, it was utterly in transition, and working class, black and white. I went to nursery school there. My sister was 10, and so she went to public school. And then over time, we moved to different places in Los Angeles as my father both got the skill necessary to become a nailer in the United States, and then he, of course, joined the Fur Workers Union, which was a pretty communist union coming from, you know, the East Coast to the West Coast. It was founded, obviously, in New York by Jews who were and Greeks who were communists, and they moved the local out to Los Angeles. There was a small fur business out there to take, you know, Hollywood stars. That's who.
That makes sense.
Who wears fur coats in Southern California, for God's sake?
Well, now, in terms of the communist politics, how much were politics a part of your family life growing up?
You know, completely and centrally. My dad was a third period communist. He joined the Communist Party in Great Britain in the early 1930s, probably around 31. And he and his brothers were active in the anti-fascist fights in the East End of London. The famous one is the Battle of Cable Street, when Mosley's black shirts marched in the East End of London. They were harassing and beating up and even killing Jews in the streets. And my dad and my uncles, there were 4 of them, known as the Brier boys. They were, as we say in Yiddish, starkas. They were big, tough, working class guys, weightlifters and boxers. And what they did is they took it to the street and they confronted Mosley in the black shirt. So I grew up hearing all the stories about the street battles. You know, I think pretty sure my dad and my uncles killed guys. I mean, it was like kill or be killed. And it was, you know, hand-to-hand combat.
And what era is this?
This is the 30s. This is the period from about 30, after Hitler comes to power, 33, 34. Sir Oswald Mosley leads the British Union of Fascists, and they start to try to do what Mussolini and Hitler did in their countries. They try to do in England, and he builds a following among, you know, largely unemployed Irish and other, you know, white working class groups, and Jews were the target. There was a small Jewish community of about 100,000 in the East End of London, and as compared to the 1 million+ Jews that were here in New York in a comparable period, they all left the same place. Just some of them ended up staying in London instead of getting on the next boat and coming over to the United States. So my dad and his, my uncles were the defense arm of the Communist Party in the East End of London. So I grew up hearing all these stories, and my dad obviously had to lie to coming into the United States to say he wasn't a communist. My dad was definitely a communist.
Wow! You know, and so did he talk to you a lot about politics?
Always.
Yeah.
He always talked.
So
about
he instilled a healthy distrust of power.
As friends have often said to me, I was it was overdetermined that I was going to be a labor historian.
Yeah, right.
You know,
it's amazing.
He didn't want me to be a worker. He didn't want me to work in a factory the way he did. He wanted me to be an intellectual. He wanted me to be a revolutionary.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So that was his angle on it. Was not that you were going to go work in a factory and join the fight that way, but he wanted something like intellectual for you, an academic.
Absolutely. He said he once looked at me. He said, "I didn't work in a factory all my life so you could work in a factory. I worked in a factory so you'd get an education and you'd use that knowledge for something good."
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So as your life progressed, how did politics enter your life beyond your father and the communist politics that he embraced? I mean, how did your life kind of intersect with what was going on in the world?
Well, I mean, I was incredibly fortunate to be in all of the right places at the right time. So in high school, I was involved a little bit in, kind of anti-nuclear stuff and a little bit. So I'm in high school from 59 to 63. That's the 3
What a
years.
ripe period. Yeah, good exactly. Lord. That's like...
and then went to Berkeley in 63 as a not even 18-year-old undergraduate. And so, I had politics in high school, but I was like a typical kid. The difference was my dad didn't shove politics down my throat.
No.
He didn't say, you're going to do this, you got to read this. He was a great father. He was this guy who was totally willing and able to let me sort of find my own way. And he would always, I'll tell you a great story later about, how he was concerned about my politics, drifting in a direction he didn't like. But
he thought you were going to the
I was deviating towards Trotskyism. That's what's his
okay. And that was a big mistake.
That was a big mistake.
Was he a Leninist?
I should say to you that the only political argument my father and I ever had in our entire life was I came home from having studied at Berkeley, and we got into a huge argument about the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which my father still defended.
Wow.
Into the 1960s, and I, of course, was incredibly critical of it. But to my father's credit, with no education, a fifth grade education, he was self-read. He read everything. Always interested in reading stuff on socialism and Marxism. My friends and I, we gave him the 3-volume of Deutscher's biography of Trotsky, and he said I was wrong. He read that, and he said I was wrong.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and this was in his 70s.
Yeah.
He was an amazing guy. My friends adored him, and would, my lefty political friends would love to come over.
Oh, I'm sure.
And talk to my dad. He was anything. He was like. His politics remained exactly what they were all the way along, except for this shift where he became a little more tolerant and a little more critical of Stalinism. He always defended Stalin for much of his life.
Yeah,
but even before he died, he came to realize that Stalin was a horrible, horrible mistake, and that he'd derailed the revolutionary movement. So, but he never jammed that down my throat. I was able to develop my own politics. And when I went away to Berkeley. I had no first person in my family to go to college, and basically no push. They never said this is what you have to do. I went. A lot of my friends were going, and where did I go? We were a working class family with no money.
Yeah.
I went to the UC system. I was a product of the public education system in Los Angeles.
Right.
And my friend said, where are you applying to college? And I said, I don't know. And they said, well, a bunch of us are applying to Berkeley. Why don't you apply there? And I thought, well, that makes sense, because why do I want to go to UCLA? It's right, I'll have to live at home. I'd rather get away. So I applied to Berkeley, and I got in.
And was it cheaper, free? What?
$50.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to Barbara Garson recently.
Yeah, she and I were there at the same time.
Right, and she was saying
she's a little older than me, but I came as a freshman. I don't know what she. Yes, it was free.
Yeah,
we paid a $50 student activity fee.
That is just devastating to think about.
It's one of the things I'm working on a book now with Mike Fabricamp on this very issue called Austerity Blues, and it's a book that's going to look at the crisis of public higher education, and I start with a historical chapter that looks at the California system and me as a young student in it. People like me couldn't go to college.
Right,
I mean, I ended up graduating as an undergraduate with a grand total of $300 in debt, which I took a National Defense Education loan at some point because I needed. My parents couldn't. I needed most of their help to literally pay for my books at the beginning of each semester, because that was like a huge expense, $150 or $200 each semester.
Yeah.
I didn't have that kind of money, but I supported myself in college on a work-study job, paying minimum wage.
It's incredible.
And it was, 15, 20 hours a week was sufficient. Yeah. And $1.15 an hour was sufficient to live on.
And I just think about my own students at CUNY and what they're struggling with.
Right, what they're struggling, and we've got one of the lower tuitions in the country.
Yeah, I know. That's what I mean. It's
just
insane.
Extraordinary.
Well, to get back to your experience at Berkeley, I mean, you were there during some ripe times, and it seems like even before that, like you said, you went to high school between '59 and '63.
Right.
That's I'm thinking of civil rights and the nuclear thing and Sputnik and ultimately the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's right. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis vividly. I was at school and we were living. I was in the 11th grade, and we were living. Then we'd moved further uptown than we used to live. So I was going to my old high school.
Right.
And I got out of school, and I made this rational calculation in my head. I don't think I can get home before the bomb drops. I got to go and find my sister where she works. She worked near my high school, and I went to her office. I'll never forget it. And everybody was huddled around the radio or the television or whatever they had.
In L.A.?
In L.A.
Yeah.
And we were convinced that this was going to be it. The bomb was going to drop, and there was going to be nuclear war.
Were you angry? Wait, just
horribly confused. I only read this later as a historian. I mean, exactly what had happened, and the American missiles in Turkey, pointing towards the Soviet Union and Khrushchev, and in the end, Khrushchev backed down and he saved the world. I mean, because God knows what Kennedy would have done.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not at all clear. So I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was much more involved in anti-nuke and peace stuff in the early 60s. The civil rights stuff I saw, but I didn't go to a school. There were almost no black students in my school.
Yeah.
There were no Latin students in my school, one or two of each. It was a largely working class and middle class Jewish high school, big, huge high school, public high school in West Los Angeles. So the civil rights movement didn't hit me till I got to Berkeley.
Yeah.
And, what I was doing was, ban the bomb, marching, for
were
those.
Were you a fan of Kennedy? I mean, Kennedy's always cast as this hero of the youth, and you were young.
Well, I think when he was assassinated, I remember being really stunned. This was pre the free speech movement, as you know, and pre my real politicization as an undergraduate. So I remember when he was assassinated, my friends and I was living in the co-op, which was a kind of the low rent.
Yeah.
Instead of the dorm, you couldn't afford the dorm. You lived in the co-op, and you performed services to get your rent reduced or whatever it was. And so we were living in the co-op, and a bunch of us just got kind of felt at loose ends, and we took the bus into San Francisco and wandered around because we were really, it was kind of a shocking event that we were utterly unprepared for. And I was more kind of dazed than I was saddened. I didn't have that much of a feeling about Kennedy other than, compared to Nixon, he was, it was night and day. I mean, we knew Nixon from California.
That's
remember.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
He had been a congressman, and he was just a horror. He was my dad always railed against Nixon for the anti-communist scum that he was.
The hardcore Cold Warrior in the most opportunistic way.
Exactly. So Kennedy seemed better. He was young. He had a beautiful wife.
There's all that.
So it was that kind of attraction of as a 17 or 18-year-old to him, but without it being informed about anything political.
Right. Yeah.
So my awakening is the free speech movement.
This is incredible. I mean, that you're a part of that awakening because it's such a touchstone moment in American history. I'm
kind of biased, but I think it's the most important it's the opening shot of the 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other things you can point to be sure, and as we know now about the history of the civil rights struggle, it goes well back into the late 40s, if not before.
It feels like a coalescing moment, though, in 64, and I want to know your involvement in it. How did you become aware that something was going on campus?
Well, if you had half a brain and were not asleep, you could miss it because all of the activity was in the entrance to the campus. If you lived on the south side of Berkeley, which I did, you would walk to campus through Sather Gate, and there was Sproul Hall and Sproul Plaza and the fountain. You couldn't miss what was going on. You would have had to be.
That's where they're setting tables up.
Yeah, if you were an engineer, you maybe went through North Campus, you might have missed it. It's a very big campus. But if you were living in South Campus and were involved in anything in social science or humanities, as I was a history major, obviously, although I didn't know that at that point in my life. You couldn't miss it. So walking to and fro, you heard all the political harangues. This was the free speech area where people were addressing about about civil rights, about nuclear weapons, about the war. Not yet the war, but certainly the military, American foreign policy, all the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was the sort of backdrop. So I was literally there when they arrested Jack Weinberg. In other words, when they brought Jack Weinberg from the core table and dragged him from that core table in front of Sproul Hall to the police car that they had parked in the plaza, one of the stupidest moves ever made.
I don't think they anticipated what happened.
They did not. They couldn't. But they brought him to the police car, and I was there in the crowd.
Yeah.
And I think it was Art Goldberg. It wasn't Mario yet, Mario Savio. I think it was Art Goldberg, and then ultimately Mario got up in the crowd and said to everybody, "Sit down. Don't let them take our comrade away."
Yeah.
So I and my friends, as I like to say, we're the right front wheel of the police car.
Wow.
We sat down in the plaza and stayed there.
Now, how did you relate to Mario Savio? Was that someone you knew from, or was that just a voice that stood up and all of a sudden he was just there?
He was a voice who stood up, and he was so obviously smart and articulate, and though he had personally, in one-to-one conversations, a bad stutter.
Yes.
And a stammer.
Yeah.
When he got up in public, he was so incredibly articulate, and he just had a kind of quiet charisma.
Yeah.
Not flamboyant. There were a lot of assholes who, tried to kind of bully their way. He was our leader.
Yeah.
It was like there wasn't even a question.
That clip of him saying, there comes a time in the operation
put your body on the block the wheels of the machine. Yeah.
It's a beautiful quote, and one that I think just comes back again and again because it's so he just articulates in such a quick moment like what the stakes of what was happening.
Not written. Off the top of his head.
It's so poetic.
And it's about alienation, and it's about, sort of...
It's like C. Wright Mills stuff.
It is. It's C. Wright Mills, and it's also a direct reaction to Kerr's uses of the university book that comes out literally the year before, and everybody had read and talked, and were talking about it, and so he's using the metaphor. He's turning Kerr's metaphor around on Kerr. Kerr says, this is a well-oiled machine. We've got to, manage it. Remember, he's a labor mediator. We've got to manage it. We've got to sort of, there are competing constituencies. It's pluralist theory writ large or writ small in the university, depending on how you want to do it. So Mario understood that he was arguing for something very, very different, and we embraced that idea. So I'm there from day one.
Did you have any idea that you were going to be doing that kind of like civil disobedience type action that day? It was just kind of like a total spontaneous...
No clue. Yeah. No clue. And I don't think anybody did.
Yeah.
It wasn't planned.
Yeah.
They made the stupid mistake of putting him in the police car.
Right.
And we were there. There were hundreds. I don't know what the real number was. Hundreds. You've seen the pictures.
Oh, it's
And then it becomes thousands. I mean, then it becomes a really huge thing. And basically, what ended it is they called in the Oakland police, and that, there was a negotiation to let him out, and he got out. And then there was this 2 months before the actual seizing of Sproul Hall, the sit-in at Sproul Hall, where politics went back and forth. And, you went to demonstrations every single day.
Yeah, it seems like this really alive moment on the campus.
Unbelievably so. Unbelievably so.
It seems like it splits into different factions pretty quickly, though, right? Like people have very different ideas of where all of it is going.
Yeah, as you would expect.
Were there reactionaries? Were there like?
There were frat guys.
Yeah,
the frat guys. There were football player guys. But the sentiment was so strong.
Yeah.
At least in a certain segment of the county. You can never speak for the engineers and the hard scientists who were up at the other. Remember, Livermore Lab was, where they did.
Well, that was part of
our whole concern.
Yeah,
about
what the university
nuclear
weapons.
That's right. What the university was turning into. So yes, there were reactionary guys. The people who ran student government were really conservative at first.
Right.
And then that changed over the course of the next year.
Yeah.
As the students on the left and the student movement really decided to take control of the student government because it was a powerful position. Right across from Sproul Hall was the student union.
Yeah.
It's still, I assume it's still there and still the same student union. But then it was a new building, and the student government had real power and real money. It had, because of the student activity fee, it could do a lot of things. So the students decided this was an important thing for us to kind of take control of, which we ultimately did. But there were real. Not so much physical confrontations as verbal confrontations around, free speech and what this was. And I think my memory of this 50 years later, it's the 50th anniversary this year, which I'm really angry at the committee, was instead of doing it in December, which would have been appropriate given when the sit-in at Sproul Hall was. They're doing in September, and some of us still work and teach. And, I can't exactly go for a week in Berkeley in September to celebrate the 60s. So
wow,
I'm a little disappointed in that. It's this month. It's
coming
right
up.
now.
Yeah, I've seen some stuff about it. So, the Sproul Hall thing, you were a part of that?
I didn't sit in. I tried to reconstruct this. One of the things I remember about that 2-month interregnum was I became very concerned that we had not built a sufficient base among the undergraduates to in effect, take the next step. And when the announcement was made that we were going to sit in at Sproul Hall, I thought it was premature. I can't remember what my thinking was.
Yeah, right.
And boy, do I regret that I came to that conclusion. But, I didn't sit in, but quickly then, given how the cops and the administration responded, there was a strike, there was that followed it after the students were dragged out and arrested, and I was actively involved in the strike in the aftermath of it.
And I mean, how did that kind of intersect with your own education? Were you scared of, like, I'm not going to get a degree here, or?
Didn't care anything about it.
No?
I mean, I think the 60s, the early 60s, are unique in some ways in American history. Honest to God, David, I don't think I spent 5 seconds worrying about, oh my God, what's this going to mean for my career?
Wow.
No one thought, you just assumed you'd get a college degree, you'd get out, you'd get a decent enough job to make a living, whatever that meant. But
our whole focus, for prosperity.
It was huge. American was the Colossus of roads.
Yeah, there's just like this unending. It's interesting because even at being like, a person that leans towards, communist or socialist ideas, certainly like left ideas, you're still like very much kind of have faith in the American system. That's
it's a really interesting and ironic point.
Yeah.
I think that's right. We never thought about it. I can remember with my friends over the 4 years as an undergraduate talking just a few times about what were we going to do afterwards. And the big question was, you go to graduate school,
right?
And and then we had that whole debate. Well, was it corrupt to become part of the university machine? And some said yes, and some said no. I got a fellowship to go to UCLA, a big 5-year fellowship to go to study history at UCLA, and I took it, and I went, and that's another story in the politics. I did different politics when I was a graduate student.
Well, when you went to graduate school and you left Berkeley, what was the situation at Berkeley? Because that story continues.
It continues, and I honestly feel blessed that I left in '67 because I did not see the craziness. My friends who stayed there, it was so disillusioning for so many people. People's Park, the kind of the ugly sort of decline of Telegraph Avenue, kind of the sort of what happened. I remember one story. It was probably 2 years after the free speech movement. There was a second strike over Navy recruiters. I get confused. When's the Summer of Love? Is it summer of
67?
67. Yeah. So it was right in that strike, and people were starting to kind of migrate towards Haight-Ashbury, and people said, "Well, don't you want to go over and see?" We smoked dope. We used to buy marijuana for like $10 an ounce,
right?
And it was like not a big deal, And so that wasn't the issue. I wasn't a Puritan about it, but it was like I said to people, you can't go to San Francisco and make believe that all the stuff that we've fought against for 2 years has gone away because a bunch of people are saying flower power and smoke and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I remember saying to one friend,
almost recognizing that the counterculture from the very beginning was a political project in a sense, or it was going to drain the politics.
It was draining. It wasn't that it itself was a political project. It had a political impact that was insidious.
Yeah.
And I can remember saying to people, we got a war to stop. That was the issue.
Yeah.
By then Vietnam had, kind of completely escalated.
Seems like it, yeah.
And so I remember saying to guys, friends who were going over to the Haight, I said, we got a war to stop. We got to organize. We don't have time for this.
Right, yeah.
And, it made me seem kind of square. But that aspect of the 60s, I loved the dope early on. I loved the rock and roll.
Right. But the lifestyle in terms of like lifestyle as politics,
that was never my interest.
That kind of like we're going to build an alternative society within the society as a model for everyone else. Seems like a very privileged position to have in a sense. You know what I mean?
And it played itself out in the 70s in really, really bad ways. What I did is I went to graduate school. I left Berkeley in '67. I started graduate school at UCLA in the fall of '67, and then over several years I got very involved in working class politics, organizing workers, putting out.
Was that a product of labor history that you?
I was just starting to get into labor history. I did my MA in '67 to '69 in European history.
Yeah.
I went away for a year to Hawaii to teach in a world civilization program because I wasn't sure what did I want to do my PhD on.
How was
and
it?
that was when the war really escalated. It's when Nixon, it was 69-70. It's when Nixon and
invaded Cambodia
bombed.
So you were in Hawaii when that happened.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was surreal.
I'm sure.
The faculty, myself among them, called the strike at the University of Hawaii. I was teaching at the Manoa campus. I had a 3-year position. It was like paradise.
I want one of those.
Yeah,
that sounds awesome.
You did. You wanted one of these.
Yeah.
It was 69. I had all my classes done by 11 a.m. I would get in my car and drive to some secluded beach in Hawaii and swim and snorkel and read books all day. It
That's
was just
amazing.
On the beach.
Yeah.
It was like,
how do you live in New York now?
Yeah, well,
after all these years in California.
It's
and
an
Hawaii?
interesting question.
Yeah.
But what I realized after 1 year there, not 9 months really, I can't be outside of where politics is happening, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to study American history to try to figure out how this country got as fucked up as it did. You know, that seemed, it was what I'd started to do at Berkeley as an undergraduate.
That exactly encapsulates why I wanted to study American history too.
And I think there are a lot of us who have that reaction. So I went back and I studied labor history. But remember, I'd studied with Leon Litwack and Larry Levine at Berkeley, and so I had a strong dose, if not of labor history, of black history and alternative forms of doing history. I did oral history in my junior year on black railroad workers. I mean, in other words, I already had that orientation, and I decided to study Europe because I was interested in Marx, and I wanted to understand sort of Europe in that context. And then I realized what I really needed to do was go back to what I'd been studying at Berkeley. And so I became a labor historian. I went back to UCLA, took my exams in 72, and then started research on my dissertation in 72. But in that period, from 70 to 72, I did pretty significant working class politics. I worked with a group called Picket Line, which was close to the Independent Socialists. So that's not a group I ever joined. That was my deviation towards Trotskyism that my father was worried about.
Are these Los Angeles groups?
Yeah.
Los Angeles-based groups?
Yeah. Well, the IS was a national, even an international group, and had its base in England, in fact. But it was they were soft trots. Okay. They were not SWPers. They had a kind of different line. I never joined. I always wanted to do the work, putting out the paper, selling the paper to workers, or trying to organize workers, all of that. I did all that while I was going to school, and that was a powerful part of my education. I met comrades who I continue to remain close with politically and personally, all these years later.
And what was the thrust of that activism? I mean, what
building rank and file. You
because I think the 1970s is like this really important time for like deindustrialization in particular. So.
Well, it was a chance to build rank and file movements, and that's, if you think of Teamsters for a Democratic Union, it was those kinds of things. There were ones in auto, in steel, in garment, and it was a real opportunity to organize workers. You had a labor bureaucracy that was very sort of hidebound, out for itself. Workers were getting really screwed. LA is not a pro-union town like San Francisco is, obviously. And so there were opportunities to do rank and file organizing, and that's what we did. The paper Picket Line was about that. I worked with, one of the leaders of that group was Robert Brenner, who's big time historian at UCLA. Its base was the UCLA History Department.
How much were you aware, you and the people that were around you, aware that something was happening with the change in manufacturing, because like losing that manufacturing base? Because that's like the cliche of the 70s now.
It is.
Like, that's where we kind of moved. We're not a manufacturing nation anymore. We're a service economy.
Right.
The working class is doing other things, it seems like.
Well, I think there was an interesting split in IS and in Picket Line over this very question. There were people who had this sort of traditional notion that the only workers who counted as workers were industrial workers. And there were those of us who believed that the economy was changing and that we made a horrible mistake if we didn't reach out to service workers, because service workers were, in many instances, where workers of color, particularly in the early 70s, large numbers of Latinos in janitorial work and all kinds of sort of hospitals.
Right.
It was a big split, a big division over, what was the real working class. And I was of the opinion that the working class was something broader than an industrial working class, that it had to encompass.
Well, I just think about the when I see working class activism happening now, it's like the $15 minimum wage for fast food workers, right. Which is like this gigantic constituency of workers that's at this point I think probably more significant in terms of numbers than manufacturing class.
Probably, if you take it all together, you have the Walmart workers in it. Yes, I think that's probably true. I think we didn't see the deindustrialization while it was happening.
How could you?
How could we? And particularly in Los Angeles, because it's a big, diverse, spread out city. It's not like it's not Detroit where you can see factories closing in quite that way, small shops. There are manufacturing concerns. GM had a plant in Van Nuys. U.S. Steel had a factory out in Fontana. I mean, there was all the ship stuff. I worked on the docks when I was in graduate school.
The aeronautics industry, my grandma came from Virginia. My dad's mom came from Virginia and moved to Los Angeles during the war to work in the airplane factories, and that's how she met my grandfather, who was stationed there for World War II. It's kind of a classic World War II California
all
story.
Of those places in Culver City and West Los Angeles, in Culver City, that became like studio lots for the film studios, those were Hughes Aircraft and Aviation. Those were all there. McDonnell Douglas. So all of those plants were spread out in Southern California and to a degree in Northern California. We were not ever able to organize, workers in that field. We were very interested in organizing service workers, steel workers, auto workers, and people on the docks, and Teamsters, which ultimately became Teamsters for a Democratic Union that swept the corrupt officials out, including Hoffa. But it was a vibrant time.
And this is why you're getting your PhD.
This is why I'm studying labor history to take my exams, which I took in '72, and started my research on coal miners, which is what my academic research is on, for my dissertation. I was interested in the motivating question for me is, as the prototypical proletarian workers, and because it was an industry that was heavily interracial, lots of blacks, lots of whites, I was very interested, given what I'd studied at Berkeley and what I was studying at UCLA, to look at the intersection of race and class in the coal mines.
Oh, that's great.
And that's what I did my dissertation.
It's a documentary on coal mines that's really famous.
The Harlan County USA, the Barbara Koppel movie, which is obviously made about the 70s. But it's still a very powerful movie. I did West Virginia. I was very interested in southern West Virginia, which had a large black workforce, and I because of what I was interested in the late 19th century. I got very interested in the Knights of Labor and sort of the early UMW, and that's what I did my work. I
can't even imagine the brutality of coal mine in the late 19th century, considering coal mine work, considering what you see in Harlan County, which is, like you said, the 1970s, a modern...
Which is modern and has elevators, and mind you, there are bad safety conditions in Kentucky mines, which is where she's focusing on in the 70s, but it's almost hard to comprehend how primitive the conditions were in some of these mines and how dangerous coal mining work was, from both explosions, of methane gas, of dust, of roof falls. They have what's called pots, which are reverse chunks of stone that literally fall from the roof because of the way they're sort of left in the roof. It's a kind of a geological formation, and these giant boulders would fall out of roofs, hit a guy in the head, and kill him.
It's such a poetic, like horrifically poetic image in terms of like just the proletarian working men just being sucked into the earth that way and being churned out and poisoning the earth. Like, all of it together just makes such a horrific image.
And it explains a lot of their militancy.
And
a lot of their ability, as they often said, in print, in UMW Journal, everybody's black underground. Because literally your face is black. You can't.
What an idea!
It's a great image.
It's like a level.
Too bad it didn't always work out that way. But there were, what I was interested in, those moments when black and white workers could find a way to come together to overcome racism and to build a common union that had a class identity. And that's what that was, I suppose, what I was hoping to build in the present. I went back to to the past to look at that. Those were the unifying principles of my intellectual life, were the things that motivated me politically.
I see it all coming together. And you know, when I think about you studying coal miners in the 1970s, I think what must you have thought when the country started turning, you know, when Reagan was elected and the country started turning towards an anti-union kind of idea? And I don't mean the country itself. I mean, you know, from the elites, I feel like that was the beginning of...
Incredibly painful. We thought the 70s was an opening that we were going to build on the possibilities of the 60s to build a real working class movement. And then when Reagan was elected, and remember, his signature is on my diploma from Berkeley. He's the governor.
Right, the governor.
He's the governor, and he runs on a viciously anti-left, anti-student, anti-communist kind of platform.
The mess at Berkeley.
The hippies, the commie hippies at Berkeley, and he wins on that.
There's a clip of him at Berkeley. I don't know if you've seen this, where he's like talking down to the professor.
I have.
And he's the most condescending asshole you've ever seen.
Unbelievable. And so I think it's we knew who Richard Nixon was.
Right.
We also knew who Ronald Reagan was.
Yeah, I mean, they're cut from the same cloth.
And he was a guy who professed at some point in his life to be someone on the left. He was a Screen Actors Guild president. He knew about communists in there, and he turned them all in. He was a shill for HUAC and the right wing.
And General Electric. And General Electric. I mean, the entire military-industrial complex.
Yes, he was a real shill for General Electric. So I think... Was I surprised what he did with Patco in '81? No,
well,
not
that's
at all.
The thing. It seems shocking, when I looking back on it. I mean, I wasn't really cognizant of it. I was too young, but Patco was something that as you begin to study American labor, it's unavoidable as a moment. That Patco was this time that the president really was sending like a very strong message.
Absolutely. That's what it all was about.
Yeah.
Patco was irrelevant in the larger scheme of things.
Yeah.
It was all about sending a message. And because the labor movement leaders have become such craven apologists for everything that was going on in American foreign policy and in the American economy, they had no ability to sort of say, wait a minute, even the way that John L. Lewis might have in the 30s, to say, wait a minute, this system isn't serving the needs of working people, we've got to do something. Even when Lewis was in his sort of most anti-communist phase, he understood that the power came from organizing workers. And by the early 80s, that was lost. That's why we were trying to build rank-and-file movements, was to try to get that back. It didn't succeed. TDU took over in the Teamsters, but then that horrible story about Ron Carey and all the rest of it.
That's right, yeah.
Where he gets accused of irregularities in terms of his own campaign and forced out of office. They would have gone after him no matter what, but he gave them the pretext. So I think by then the handwriting was on the wall, and what we saw, and what I've learned to understand historically, is this is the opening shot of the neoliberal agenda.
Right.
And, Patco was one key aspect of that neoliberal attack. And what ended up happening in the subsequent decades was the demonization of anything public.
Yeah.
Any idea that anything public, like the institution we're sitting in now, was good and important and necessary.
Well, the market could do it better. That's the lie that was embedded, and has been embedded to the point where, I teach at Baruch College, which is a lot of young business students, and they've completely internalized that viewpoint. That the government is worthless, and that the free market can deliver everything better, even though history doesn't bear that out.
No, exactly.
What I was going to ask you is that we had talked about right before we took a break, we were talking about neoliberalism and that kind of move towards this embrace of the market strategy over everything else, or the market itself, and this kind of like faith in capitalism that's so amazing, considering how capitalism is not that great a system for delivering the goods when it comes down to it. I guess it depends on who you ask.
For the people on top, it's a great system. It's a beautiful system. It delivers the goods and then some. I think what's always amazing to me, and I don't want to get into what's the matter with Kansas kind of argument, but I do think it's stunning sometimes how people can sort of not even in the most direct way, understand their own self-interest and how they're being jobbed by the system. So just the other day, reading an article in the New York Times about the implementation of Obamacare in Kentucky, you know, in Mitch McConnell's state where he's up for re-election. And, you know, there's sort of, the New York Times reporter is sort of talking about, interviewing some people. And so there's this poor, white, working-class woman who's gotten onto Medicare and onto Medicaid, you know, because the state, at some moment, they were able to sort of, you know, get that through. She's like, her health has improved dramatically. But you talk to her about not just Obama, but about Obamacare, and she's opposed to it. And so you look at that and you say, how can that be? I mean, how do they not understand?
I mean, it's one thing to, like, criticize Obamacare for what it didn't do. It's another thing to be, like, opposed to the idea in general, particularly when it's, you know, even the little things they did with Obamacare made things better. You know, it just eliminating the pre-existing condition thing. You know,
or that you could keep your kids on till they're 26. Or, you know, those kinds of issues have really been incredible steps. Is it everything we want? Not at all. Not even close. But it's this sort of notion somehow that the right has been so brilliantly successful at demonizing government at every level. And it's not like, you know, as people on the left, we believe the government's the solution to all problems, because we know that's not the case. And yet, by demonizing government, they basically demonize any effort that speaks to anything other than the private system to deliver the goods, which it's not. In any objective measure, you can't say that that's happening.
Well, we need a more nuanced vision of what the quote-unquote government is, because it's not, I mean, it is and it isn't a monolithic thing. I mean, it's hard because it's like, you know, coming out of the 1960s and 70s, you think the state was such an oppressive entity. You know what I mean? You have, like, the FBI and the CIA and Vietnam itself, and you're, like, seeing the state as just this absolutely horrific thing and an enemy of the people and an enemy of the left and everything. At the same time, it's kind of the only structure that is capable of kind of ameliorating the shitty things that capitalism produces. It's like our own. It's kind of a paradox that we're.
It's an enormous paradox. I think it's made clear by sort of the New Deal. Which is why it's interesting to study the New Deal, what the New Deal did and what it didn't do. What we never want to do is romanticize the New Deal, but what we want to say is the New Deal did many of the things that we've come to accept, what we called in Who Built America the partial welfare state, which is all we have in this country, and it's a tattered and even more partial welfare state than it was even 20 years ago, in part because it's a successful attack of neoliberalism on all governmental institutions. But we understand that what happened in the 30s and 40s had to do with the power of an organized working class. Was it partial? Absolutely. Was it racially divided? Absolutely. Did black workers get a rawer deal than white workers? Absolutely. All that's true. And yet, some of the basic protections that we take for granted come because of those struggles that happen.
That was the right direction to go.
Absolutely. So when I say to my students, when I teach labor history to workers at the Murphy Institute, and I say to them, you know, at the beginning of class before we teach them, he says, well, how come we only work 8 hours, 5 days a week? And, you know, I mean, a lot of them who don't know think, oh, well, isn't that guaranteed in the Constitution or something? And, you know, and it's a reasonable response. How would you not assume that isn't natural? But no, you have to then tell them that this is a struggle. People died.
The system will work you to death.
That's correct, and it did, and only with struggle did we get. And that's part of the legacy of the New Deal. I mean, how bad is the Fair Labor Standards Act? Horrible. In every respect. But it was the beginning of the codification of things that got better over time. When the organized working class had power in this country, coming out of World War II and into the 50s.
Well, in terms of your own development, I mean, you'd mentioned Herbert Gutman before we started recording again here. When did you become aware of him, and what impact did he have on you? Because I didn't know him, obviously.
Yeah, you didn't have the pleasure.
But every one of my advisors and all the people, the historians that are important to me here at the Community Graduate Center and helped in my dissertation, all speak so kind of heroically of this man.
Well, so it's an interesting story. So I left graduate school in 1976. I was offered a job in New York to be the research director of something called the American Labor History Series, which was a 10-part dramatic series that WGBH television, the PBS station in Boston, was developing. And a woman named Elsa Rosbach was running it. And she interviewed me and hired me to be the research director. And I had not finished my dissertation. I'd written one chapter of my dissertation, which I'd had published. I was working on a second, and this job came up, and I said to it was 1976, and I was saying to myself, and there was already something of a job crisis in the history profession. This idea somehow there was a golden age that now all of you living through. There was a job crisis even then, because what was happening was people who we reasonably expected to retire, my age group back then weren't retiring, because the Supreme Court soon after had, I can't remember when the Supreme Court decision came down, couldn't force mandatory retirement based on age.
Interesting.
And so professors
hanging around.
Right. Look at this building. I'm a youngster in this building, and I'm 68. So so there weren't a lot of jobs, and I was at a point in my life, given the politics I was doing, that I wasn't sure I wanted to become a conventional academic and go get an academic job and get on the academic treadmill.
Sure.
So this job offer came out of the blue. I didn't apply for it. She reached out to me. I came for an interview from L.A., and I accepted the job. I moved my family. I had a 5-year-old daughter and my then wife, and we moved to New York in the midst of the coldest winter that they'd had in 30 years. It was like a nightmare winter, the winter of 75, 76. I don't even think I had a top coat. But within 2 months, I'd met Herb Gutman. Because he was an advisor, or a month. He was an advisor on that series. And I kind of knew his name.
Yeah.
I probably read the AHR piece, but I'm not even sure I had even then, because I was already...
About slavery.
But I know I read... I will say this. I know I read his R.L. Davis article on, in his collection, although maybe I didn't even read that until I met him in New York, because that came in later. Long story short, I met Herb, and among the many great things that I did in that series, I only lasted in that job 9 months, as the series, long story that's not worth getting into, but the most enduring thing I got out of it, besides a lot of good friends, I met Josh Brown, who was working on that. I met Leon Fink and Sue Levine, who were dear friends. I met Carol Groneman, another labor historian, but most importantly, I met David Brody, but most importantly, I met Herb.
And so, what was it about Herb Gutman that impressed you so much? Why is he in the annals of community heroes?
I think he's in the annals.
I was talking to Clarence Taylor about him, and he just like the same.
Herb was larger than life. This is a perfect image. I'm going to show you a picture of the two of us.
Yeah,
that's me. That's Herb. And that's a classic Herb Gutman pose with the finger pointing.
And that just looks like someone's kitchen.
It's his kitchen in Nyack, New York. Yeah.
What a great photo.
Yeah, it's a great photo. I love that photo. It's just so Herb. It's so the essence of Herb. That's me.
Wow.
That's what I look like in the 70s. That's probably
that picture is a nostalgia.
That picture is probably 79 or 80, I'm guessing. Maybe a little later, 81. So Herb was then running in 77. He began the first summer seminar that NEH gave for labor leaders. He organized the first summer seminar for labor leaders. And he taught it in 77 and 78. And I had been working with him on the labor history series, and we'd always kept in touch.
Right.
And, we talked about, could we find a way to work together? We just hit it off. I mean, we just had that's our relationship.
A camaraderie.
It was a camaraderie, and, he was like, he was like the advisor I wish I'd had in college.
Yeah,
you know, it's just like I didn't have.
It's interesting that kind of after your PhD, you meet this kind of like
I meet this iconic figure.
Yeah.
And so he taught it in 77, 78, and then in 79 he said to me, "Would you like to come and be the associate director of this, and we'll co-teach labor history to workers?" And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I said,
awesome.
"Are you kidding me?"
Yeah.
Of course. And I was freelancing at that point. I didn't have a regular job. I was working at WNET. I had a range of, like you're doing now.
Sounds like my life, yeah.
Exactly like your life.
Yeah.
I was doing that thing. You know,
kind of
making up my mind.
To history, definitely, but
yeah,
not sure
always been doing history, but doing it on film.
Yeah.
I'd learned to become a filmmaker. That's the thing I had decided I wanted to be, was to use documentary and dramatic film to do historical ideas and information.
That's great.
And so he invites me to teach this thing at the old Graduate Center.
Yeah.
And 1 month every summer for the next 2 summers, I teach this seminar with Herb, and it was like what we were doing was we were teaching the new labor history to workers.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't just take union officials, he wanted rank and file leaders. So one of my jobs was to beat
That's
the
his
bushes.
whole thing,
yeah,
right? I mean, social
beat
history.
the bushes and find rank and file workers who could come along with, leaders. And we had this great seminar of 15 people. They had to apply. We read their applications. Why did they want to study labor history? And somewhere at the end of the first year, 79, I said to Herb, as great as this is the best teaching I've ever done. It's like a treat to co-teach with you.
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing to co-teach with her. He was a brilliant seminar leader. He couldn't lecture very well. He was always confused in big audiences, but as a seminar leader, he was just beyond compare. Just really gifted. And I said to him, we're not going to change the world 15 workers at a time. Maybe what we ought to do is sort of take this good idea about this curriculum and create something that we can send out to workers through worker education programs and adult ed programs. And out of that, the idea for the American Working Class History Project was created. Josh may have told you this. And so when we did the seminar in 1980, I then spent the time that whole summer writing the proposal that would ultimately go to the NEH for the American Working Class History.
Life. Yeah.
This is your life. Right. We were creating this curriculum that was going to go out. And in the process of pulling that together, it was great. We got a big grant. We got a $400,000 grant.
Wow.
And then Herb went to the Ford Foundation the very next year and got an even bigger grant from Ford. So we were $1 million project in 1980-81.
That's incredible.
And so we then said, we need to hire a group of people. And it was like choosing a baseball team. Yeah. So what we had decided early on in that process, we were going to write a book. We were going to write a textbook reinterpretation of American history that put working people at the center, who built America. And we were also going to produce a series of films and audiovisual things to go along with it. It was going to be a multimedia curriculum. That was my contribution.
And this is before the internet.
Well before the internet.
But the impulse, you know what I mean? Like the impulse to use media. I mean, it's a new media project.
It's a new media project when new media was 16 millimeter film and videotape.
It's kind of extraordinary. It's something that people would do on the internet today.
That's exactly right. I wouldn't even think twice about it. It would all be done on the internet.
Yeah.
So we were always at the cutting edge.
Yeah.
And that cutting edge always kept moving.
Yeah, right.
Of technology, educational technology.
And at a certain point, the name became the American Social History Project.
Well, and that's an interesting story. As Josh may have told you, what happened was when we went to Ford was not interested in adult workers and worker education programs. They were interested in community colleges.
Yeah.
That was their big community college pitch. They said, well, look, we're interested in what you're trying to do, but we're interested only in a community college. And, they kind of said, the title's a little off-putting. We know you do working class history, but can you come up with another title? I came up with American Social History Project, and it was a kind of compromise.
Yeah.
There's only one person in this building who still calls it the American Working Class History Project. Bill Kornblum in sociology was one of our first.
He refused to give it up.
He just, I don't think he even fully understands to this day that we changed the name.
Wow, that's great.
He was one of our first advisors. We had a group of advisors in the building. We were in the old building over on 42nd Street. So we put a staff together, and the first person I hired, Josh Brown.
That's awesome.
I knew him from Elsa and from Radical History Review. And I said to Herb, I want one. He picked the first person to work as a writer, Bruce Levine, one of his former students, who's now a chaired professor at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I picked Josh.
Well, I mean, I can't really overstate how important the ASHP was to me in my own development as a historian and as a student here at the Graduate Center. Finding out about Herb Gutman, finding out about what social history is and what the methodology is and what the whole approach is, it kind of was a moment for me, like you had, it sounds like, moments that kind of like perfectly combine, the study of history with your political outlook and with like what you're doing. It's really great hearing your story.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, David. It's nice to tell it, and I feel in the kind of, as I sit and look back at this career, I've been pretty blessed to be able to do pretty much exactly what I wanted to do. And there aren't many people in the world who get to be able to say that.
No, knock on wood. Thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Welcome.
I appreciate it.